in My Hero Academia Remastered: The Future Generation. I call it the Future Generation since, well, it is the Future Generation, and Coda is like a pro hero. Where Coda and Eri are pro heroes, except for that Coda and Eri are actually things, and Ida's the principal. I meant to say Ida was the principal, not Aizawa. Aizawa would hate being the principal. Ida is the principal. I got the name back. Deku's oldest kid is not going to be called Daichi, because I remember the name was Toshinori that I gave him, since he wanted to name him Toshinori after All Might, you know. All Might's name is Toshinori. So, and it's Katsumi now, not Kazumi, for Bakugo's daughter. So, we left off with the sports festival final rounds. Let's just get started. Katsumi would easily defeat Toby, because I'm going to call him Toby, because I want to. Katsumi would literally just one explode him, knocking him straight out. The next match would actually be a really good match. Christian versus NG. Christian says, "Alright, NG, let's see what you got." And he says, "I'm way better than you." He says, "Oh, please." NG creates a fire blade, and tries to strike. Christian says, "Oh, please." And puts fire into his hand and says, "Fire blaster puncher." He says, "Fire punch," one-shotting him, knocking him straight out. The next is like the semifinal, well actually the quarterfinal. I'm gonna skip a lot until the semifinals are up. The first match of the semifinals is Daichi versus Christian. The next one is Katsumi versus Bakumi. I just call him Bakumi because I couldn't think of a better name. Basically, he would run. So basically, the first match would be Christian would say, "Alright, did I say Daichi again? It's Toshinori." He'd say, "Well, Toshinori, I guess we're fighting." He'd say, Toshinori would say, "Detroit Smash." Christian would say, "Oh, please, you don't have to be like that." He puts out one hand forward and says, "How about this?" And blasts so much fire, in stopping it immediately, hitting him with the full brunt of the fire, saying, "Come on, Daichi, more! Give me more power!" He'd say, "Delaware Smash!" It would just create ice spikes, blocking and actually hitting Daichi in the process, cutting him up. Rish would say, "Cool, but I don't think this." He said, Daichi says, "I know your weakness. You can't fight in close range." Christian says, "Oh, really?" He creates a fire sword out of... Well, actually, no. He creates ice spikes, kicks one ice spike off, and forms it into a sword and says, "Oh, I can't?" And then he goes, "Sing, sing, 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 sing." Daichi's like, "When could he fight in close combat?" Christian says, Toshinori says, "When could you fight in close combat?" He says, Christian says, "I always could, Toshinori. You never beaten me." He blasts him with even more fire, knocking out Toshinori, saying, "That was too much fun." The next match, Bakumi versus Katsumi. The winner is going to be Katsumi with her raw power, with the explosion being on her side. Being like, the last match, Christian versus Katsumi. He says, "Finally, time to take you down, Katsumi." He says, "I'm gonna destroy you and prove to you that I'm way better." Christian says, "Yeah, right. I'd like to see you try." When the match immediately starts, he'd go for a giant explosion. Christian would say, "Please." Creates an ice wall blocking the attack without the ice wall even breaking. She's like, "How? That was literal." She says, "Fine, whatever. That wasn't even my strongest explosion." Christian says, "Oh, please, you're weak." He says, "Just admit that you're weak." And he says, and she goes, "Shut up." He creates more ice spikes and she just blasts through all of them. And he says, "Pretty good." He says, "I'll be using a little bit of my power." He says, "Well, if we're having a one-sided battle fight." Christian would return his ice and say, "Let's go!" Blasting forward, going, going right next to Katsumi and punching with a fire punch with full power, with full force, sending her flying up in the air. And then she says, "I'm not done!" Boom. Blasting forward, saying, "Burst speed!" Chris would say, "Yeah, right, in your dreams." He says, blasting forward. They go up and clash with each other, headbutting. And then Christian would kick Katsumi down, saying, "Yeah, right, you think you're ever gonna beat me?" Then he jumps way high up in the air and says, flies all the way up, and Katsumi follows, going even faster than he is, approaching. Then he says, "Perfect." Katsumi would go for a punch. He'd dodge, grab Katsumi's arm, kick her in the stomach, then grab her face with one of his hands, and then blast down. He'd go, "I won't lose to you," doing the Bakugo thing, blasting down, going, "Yeah!" Defeating, well, not defeating, but sending down, doing big damage to Katsumi. He says, "Damn it!" Bakugo says, "Wow, that was my technique." He says, "Deku, you remember that?" He says, "Yeah, I do. You used that on me, and that hurt." He said, "Damn right it did, nerd." He says, "Really? You're still gonna call me a nerd?" He says, "Alright, fine, you're no longer a nerd, even though you're the #1 hero somehow." Still don't know how. He says, "So take those old records home." Katsumi would say, "No, no, no, no." He'd say, "Howser." She would say, "Oh, you want a tornado battle." He says, "Let's go." Blasting forward, spinning around, saying, "Blaze impact." She says, "Howitzer impact." Clashing. And everyone's like, "What?" He'd go, These two would still be standing after that clash. Bruce would say, "I got one more move up my sleeve." He says, "Come at me." She'd immediately rush at me and say, "I learned this move from a while ago." When she's about to explode him, he says, "Fire tornado!" A black swirl comes around them with blazing not Christian, but only Katsumi. Going, "Sah!" He goes, "Let's go." And he says, "Just so you don't get out." Puts more black fire all over it, saying, "You're way too weak. Don't even try to beat me, weakling." He says, "You're all weak." And blast, and puts an ice barrier around it, so even when the thing goes out, she's trapped. And he says, but out of nowhere, Katsumi would blast in and hit him in the stomach with a blast. Then she says, "How about a stun grenade?" He goes, "Shoot, not a point-blank range stun grenade." He gets hit with a point-blank stun grenade, sending him flying back. Then he blasts himself up in the air, saying, "This is part of my mom's quirk." Ah! He creates a black fire axe, saying, "This is part of Momo Yairosu's quirk. It's part of creation." He creates a fire axe and starts going, "Sing, sing, sing, sing." And he says, "Alright, if that's not gonna work." Then she'd go back and say, "Howitzer impact." Chris would say, "I don't want to do this. This is not going to kill you. It'll do a lot of damage to you." He puts his hand forward and stabs Katsumi right through the stomach with a fire sword, saying, "I didn't want to do this, but it came down to this." Everyone else stands like, he killed her! Bakumi would say, Katsumi would say, I'm not done! Which would release the fire blade and say, he says, now this is a fight if I've ever seen one, Katsumi. He says, damn right it is. They'd go, with their full powers, they start blasting each other with their full blast, damaging each other so much, till they both fall to their knees. They go, he says, let's finish this. She says, yeah. She goes, stun grenade. Blasting a stun grenade. Krishna would create 2 razor fire blade thingies and say, but then he said, no, Krishna doesn't even say it. He says, I learned this move from my grandpa. He says, prominence burn. Everyone in the stands is like, prominence burn. He says, prominence burn. Actually wrecking through it, burning Katsumi so hard that she's knocked out of the arena. And he says, Krishna on top says, and falls to his knees saying, dang it, I should have done better. Out of nowhere he gets really angry. They create the fire tornado around him saying, dang it, this should have been so much more easy. Why am I so weak? And creates a fire tornado around him. Everyone's like, oh no. Then Midnight would use her quirk to knock him out. And he'd be like, then when he looks up, he's got a muzzle on his face. He's like, why the hell do I have a muzzle on my face? Deku's about to give him a reward, but Krishna would blast off the thing. When Krishna would get it, he'd say, screw all of this. Blasting off in the air, saying, zooming through the sky, little fireflies. Todoroki goes, that kid. He just blasts off and says, screw it. He says, then when he gets home, he actually goes to Endeavor's house. Endeavor says, you used it, huh? He says, sorry. Endeavor would say, hugging him, saying, you did it! You finally learned that prominence burn. He's like, huh? Thought you told me never to use that. He says, well, it was in a dire situation for you to win. He says, and you've protected your pride better than Shoto did. He lost to that Bakugo guy. Christian says, he actually lost? Wow, that should have been pretty. That was actually kind of fun. He says, he says, also, where did you learn that fire tornado? He says, Father told me that Dobby could use a fire tornado, so I used it. He says, oh, you mean Toya? Guys, this is not full of proof. I'm just gonna say that because it makes sense. He says, oh, Toya. He can use that. He says, Toya, come out here. Toya Todoroki says, what? He says, can you show me your fire tornado? When he does it outside, it absolutely annihilates 20 trees. Christian goes, whoa. He goes, is that all you wanted? And he says, nope. I want to try it out. He says, watch the sports festival. He says, fine. He watches and says, whoa. You used the fire tornado? He says, yep. He says, show me it now. He says, okay. He goes, swirling around and breaking like 100 trees around him, saying, so how'd I do? He says, that was amazing. And that guy's gonna be in for part 2 of 45.